Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nia Dumas. I am a political science major, international studies minor at Spelman College, and it is my utmost pleasure to welcome you to Courageous Conversations, Black in the C-Suite. Courageous conversations are intended to inform and inspire, to build connections, celebrate, and to challenge our perceptions of what is possible for African American women to achieve in today's world. Our community and our country are increasingly having critical conversations surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. During this era of change, it is essential for Spelman to tap into its legacy of serving women of color and its global networks to foster discourse. This afternoon's conversation will be between the 10th president of Spelman College, Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, and Miss Stacey Abrams, Spelman alumna, class of 1995. This conversation is exciting not only for me as a Spelman student, but also as the president and campus chapter manager of Spelman's chapter of Fair Fight U, and on-campus chapter of Miss Abrams' National Voting Rights Advocacy Organization. Miss Abrams, we congratulate and celebrate you on your recent nomination for this year's Nobel Peace Prize and your work to protect voting and civil rights of our nation's most vulnerable communities is truly inspiring. As a first-year student entering the collegiate and political arena, you inspired me to get involved with voting rights and making sure our rights to vote are always protected. Thank you for your tireless pursuit of equality and your strength in the face of corruption. And thank you, President Campbell, for hosting this series and spearheading these important and necessary conversations. President Campbell became the 10th president of Spelman in August of 2015. An art historian and Romare Bearden scholar who recently published a well-received biography of his life, Dr. Campbell spent 10 years as the executive director at the Studio Museum in Harlem and 23 years as the dean of the Tisch School of Arts at New York University before coming to Spelman. Now, with great pleasure and honor, everyone please join me in a virtual applause to welcome two extraordinary women, Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell and leader Stacey Abrams.
Thank you so much, Nia, for that warm and welcoming introduction. And thank you so much for your leadership on our campus. We have just lived through a momentous national election and Georgia election. And you and our honored guests have been just absolutely critical to both of those processes. So thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I am truly excited to welcome this afternoon one of Spelman College's stellar alumni, Stacey Abrams. I have to tell you that we have over 2,000 attendees for this session. So I know we have a lot of people who are every bit as excited as I am to begin our conversation. So I'm going to get it underway right away. After serving 11 years in the Georgia House of Representatives and 7 as Democratic leader, Stacey Abrams became the first Black woman to become a gubernatorial candidate for a major party in the United States. In 2018, she launched Fair Fight to ensure every American has a vote in our election system through programs such as Fair Fight 2020, an initiative to fund and train voter protection teams in 20 battleground states. In addition to her political work, she is also the author of 8 best-selling books, which she writes under the pen name Selena Montgomery. And I should also add, she is a successful entrepreneur. Her latest book, While Justice Sleeps, will be released in May of 2021. Oh, that's coming up very soon. Stacey Abrams, we are delighted that you're here with us for this conversation, which is designed to really be very candid, to share openly among your community some insights into your life and into the journey that you have taken. So I'm going to get started with some of the questions. First of all, I'm intrigued by the notion that you graduated really at the top of your class from a Georgia high school, and you had your choice probably of any college you wanted to attend. Why did you choose Spelman College?
Well, Dr. Campbell, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to Nia for her extraordinary leadership, not only of the work we do at Fair Fight U, but the work she's doing on Spelman's campus as the honor of serving as SGA president. So she has both my congratulations and my condolences because I know what that job means. I I will tell you, I was tricked into Spelman. I I grew up in Gulfport, Mississippi. We moved to Georgia when my parents were admitted to Emory University for graduate school. I enjoyed living in Atlanta, but I had every intention of going north for college. I wanted to get out of the South, and I certainly didn't want to go to an all women's college, in part because I was not permitted to date until I was 16. So I was a senior in high school before I was technically eligible to date in my family. And the notion of going from my first year of dating to a women's college just seemed anathema to me. But my mom said, well, just apply. You don't have to go, just apply. So I applied. I also applied to Sarah Lawrence, to Swarthmore, Vassar, and a handful of other colleges, but really those were my top choices. And when I was admitted, my mother said, well, I know they're exciting, but why don't you go visit Spelman? And it appealed to me because I could take a day off of school and go to the campus and spend the night. I got to Spelman and three things happened. One was that I met Janetta Cole, one of your predecessors. And the remarkable thing about Dr. Cole was that she had such an air of just confidence, but also of kindness. And the conversation she had with us as students was truly about how we would grow to be women and what this journey could look like. But the second thing that happened was that they took us on a tour of the campus and we came back and I heard this ruckus it was LLC2 in the auditorium, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on. And all I could think is, oh my God, that's my father and they're creating this problem. And indeed, I was right. My dad had riled up the dads to complain about visiting hours on Spelman's campus and the fact that Morehouse was across the street and he wasn't sending his daughter here so men could run, into our dorm rooms. And Janetta Cole did something I've seen only my mother accomplish, and that was shut my father up. And so that was very compelling to me. But truly, the third piece was that spending time with those young women, having these conversations with young women who'd only ever wanted to go to Spelman, it really reset for me my expectations of what college could be. And I was trepidatious. I had not gone to school in majority Black communities before. And so I was afraid of going to a school that would focus all of these things in one space, my Blackness, my womanhood, and my academic interest. But what came of going to Spelman was that I was able to realize that race and gender are extraordinarily important markers that we should never diminish, but that Spelman gave you an opportunity to be wholly yourself and to recognize that if you made mistakes, it wasn't because you were Black or a woman, it's probably something else. And I say that flippantly, but I mean it in the most sincere way, that being able to be wholly confident in who you are and what you want to accomplish is made so much stronger at Spelman because you are not denied your agency because of people's expectations of race or gender, that your sense of agency and thus your ownership of your decisions truly belongs to you as a person, as a student, and as a woman growing into her power.
That's so wonderful to hear. And you should be pleased to know that Dr. Janetta B. Cole is in the audience today, our first sister president at Spelman College. In talking about owning your agency, you really exercised that agency while you were at Spelman. So I understand that you had an issue and you literally took it to a Board of Trustees meeting. Can you tell us about that meeting and what the issue was?
So as a student at Spelman, I came in with a pretty healthy set of scholarships, but I also had to take loans out because my parents were both in graduate school and my older sister was in college down the street at Agnes Scott. We had no money and we had even less leeway. And so I very strongly relied on financial aid. I lived in LLC 1, and I went to Packard Hall where financial aid was, and I'd spent almost 2 hours learning about the fact that my tuition would be going up, but my scholarships would not be increasing to meet the cost. And as someone who truly had no other recourse, there were limits to what we could borrow. My parents didn't have the credit. And it was those challenges that often face students who do not come from means. I was coming back across campus just irate about it. And I noticed that there were these signs up saying that the Board of Trustees was meeting in LLC 2 and that it was a private meeting, but it was also just notification. Well, I decided that they needed to understand my concerns and that likely they were there to increase or approve the increase in my tuition without an attendant change to how students like myself would be able to afford to stay and get this education. It was my freshman year. So my temerity was high and my knowledge of what a board of trustees was superficial, but I knocked on the door and the secretary of the college opened the door and I could see Dr. Cole standing in front of the table, the very long table where the trustees were arrayed. And she had that look on her face because she knew what I was like. And so she said, "Yes, Miss Abrams." And I asked if I could come to the meeting. And she said, well, to her knowledge, there was no prohibition against it. And so she let me in. I came to the table and there was Alan McDaniel and Lucy Vance were sitting at the table and they kind of spread out and the secretary of the college rolled a chair up for me and Alan slid his notebook over towards me. And I looked down and saw the financial statements that they were going over, did not understand what I was looking at. I'd never been in a meeting like that before. I didn't truly have full comprehension of what was happening, but I knew that these were people who had the power to decide whether I had a chance to fulfill my education and that as a student, I had the responsibility to raise this issue. They let me speak, which I learned later was completely against protocol. And what was even more, I think, transformative for me was that they invited me again. We had a student trustee because Spelman has always had that tradition, but they recognized that my interest and my engagement was sincere. And because of that, I became, a student of how boards worked. I learned how to read financial statements. But more importantly, I got to sit in a room with some of the most powerful, some of the wealthiest, some of the most educated people in America. And coming from my background, I'd never expected to find myself in that room. And it was being given, it was having my audacity met with acceptance as opposed to being dressed down or sent away that really changed how I thought of my role at Spelman and more importantly, my role in speaking up, not only for myself, but for others who found themselves in the same situations.
So you were in the room where it happened, and you found the room, you came in, and you made your voice heard in that room.
I had my cleanest jeans and my nicest t-shirt on.
And when you graduated from Spelman, you went to Yale Law School. What did you take with you? Yale, which was one of the finest law schools in the country. What did you take from Spelman that enabled you to succeed at Yale?
So in between Spelman and Yale, I did a master's degree at the University of Texas. And I mentioned that for this reason. I left Spelman very committed to doing a joint degree in law and public policy. I'd become one of Spelman's Truman Scholars, and we hadn't had very many of them. And the two who'd won, one had gone to law school, the other went to policy school. So when I applied, I thought, say you do both and you'll double your chances of winning. It seemed to work. So that's what I did. But it was during my tenure during my time at UT for my graduate work that Dr. Cole and Lewis Blair, who was the head of the Truman Foundation, ganged up on me. And even though Texas was an extraordinary school and the law school was a very, very strong law school, they both challenged me to apply to Yale. I hadn't applied as an undergrad because I didn't think I was smart enough. I thought that I had a difficult experience with the Rhodes Scholarship process, and it really hurt my sense of capacity. And so I turned down opportunities to go to Harvard Law and other very high profile schools. And UT was let's be clear, UT was in the top tier as well. But I felt that UT was in that top 5, but it wasn't so heavy that if I made mistakes, it would ruin me, or worse, it would reaffirm that those who made my Rhodes experience so difficult that it would reaffirm some of the challenges that I had felt were being spoken to who I was in my capacity. And Dr. Cole and Mr. Blair said that I was being foolish, that it was my responsibility to challenge that misapprehension that they had. Because during my experience with the Rhodes, one of the judges said, "Oh, you go to that black school, don't you?" And my process in that, that was one of the nicer parts of that process. And so it really undermined my sense of my capacity. And I think because of Spelman and because of the Truman, and more importantly, because of the personal challenge that they brought to me, I applied to Yale and was admitted, shocked the dickens out of me. And when I got in there, it, my first few days, I was terrified because I didn't come from the economic space that students usually came from. I think I was one of only 2 students from the state of Mississippi in the entire school, and the only, one of a handful with my economic constraints. But being in that place and then finding myself being competitive, being able to answer questions. I didn't come from a family of lawyers. I'd never been inside a courtroom, but I did have this ability to think and to discern. And what I learned at Spelman traveled with me. What I learned from UT traveled with me. What my parents instilled in me, the sense that you don't have to know the answers. You just have to know how to ask the right questions. And you have to be willing to learn. That those pieces traveled with me. And that made Yale much less terrifying. It was still a bit of a heady experience, and it was off-putting. I mean, half the class was either from Harvard or Yale. And for me, there was always I wouldn't say a tension, but there's always an awareness of your difference. But it was at Yale that I really understood that that difference would only matter as much as I permitted it to matter. I couldn't diminish someone else's, negation of my sense of self, but I could decide if I was going to accept what they saw and what they thought.
Yeah. I think that's a very important part of your narrative for our students. And there are several hundred of our students who are with us today. For our students to hear, we have a huge number of students who leave Spelman and go on to law school. So I think every word that you have just spoken are incredible bits of insight for them. So thank you for that. Now, what I find fascinating about your career is that, leaving law school, you actually allowed yourself to try many things, to practice law, to write novels, to have a small business, and then ultimately to go into politics. What would you say to students who have multiple passions and skills as well? It wasn't just that you liked doing these things, you were good at doing these things.
Well, again, I have to credit Spelman. And at the time, it was Dean Freddie Hill who challenged my multiple majors. So in my first year, I double majored in physics and philosophy with a minor in theater. I dabbled in history and English. I did creative art. I did television and film at Clark Atlanta. Thought that would be something I studied. And finally, Dean Hill, and I think nudged along by Janetta Cole, basically made me write a paper about what I wanted to know when I left college. And they made me speak to the incoming class about it. And it was really to say, you don't have to diminish or remove something that you're passionate about. You just have to figure out how it all fits together. And so often we believe that college is about picking the single thing that you will do or you will be. And that's all you get to do or be. And for me, it was an opportunity to put language to what had always been one of my challenges. I like a lot of different things, and my facility for learning and for doing was sufficient for me to be able to try many things. I actually graduated from Spelman with what was called an independent major. I did political science, economics, and sociology, and it was the first time I had to think through, how do I make the pieces fit? And so what I would say to students is, no matter where you are in your education, and you could be a Spelman graduate watching this, it is not about making things look the way they look for others. It's about figuring out how your pieces fit together. But it's going to require sacrifice. When I'm writing a novel, that means there's something else I want to do that I'm not doing. And I've always had to give primacy to the job that paid for my house. And then secondly, for the job that paid for my car. And then third, for the job that feeds my soul. But I've never decided that my soul gets left out. It just may not get as much at the moment that it needs. But it's always, I call it Jenga. It's not work-life balance. It is a Jenga game. And so your job is to pull out the pieces that you need and recognize that if you pull out a piece and the whole thing falls apart, you can just rebuild it.
Right.
And that's, I think, the most important piece of making all of the pieces fit.
Right. So what ultimately led you to politics?
I have always been interested in government, in part because when we were growing up, my parents were working poor, but they were very involved in social justice and social justice action. They would take myself and my 5 siblings with them. We would volunteer, and we were really engaged in community. And one day I asked my parents, I'm like, I don't understand how 2 Black people and their 6 kids are going to fix Mississippi. I need you to explain the efficiency of this model. And my parents said, well, we can't fix it. We vote because we get to choose the people in charge, and we volunteer for the places where they miss. But government is supposed to do many of the things. They're supposed to fix the things that are broken, and government has a role to play. And unfortunately, it overlooks too many people. And so I became fascinated with what government should or should not do, how it should work. And that's what my academic course of study was at Spelman. I didn't think I was going to run for office when I got to Spelman, but during my freshman year, I ended up getting into a disagreement with Maynard Jackson, who was the mayor, and he won the argument. We were arguing about the treatment of young people in the wake of the Rodney King decision. But as a sophomore, he offered me a job at the Office of Youth Services. And being in that role, being able to see the workings of a mayor and a city council that may not have solved every problem, but were really intentional about wanting to understand how to do right, I realized I wanted to be mayor one day. I then had the opportunity to work for Shirley Franklin on her campaign with an introduction from Janetta Cole, and then later on to work in her office as deputy city attorney, worked for the city of Atlanta as deputy. And it was there that I realized, one, I did not want to be mayor. That is an extraordinary job, but it was not the job for me.
Right.
But two, that wanting to do the things I thought were necessary for the city and for the state, and more importantly for the people, required statewide action. And so that's what led me to run for my first office, which was state legislature in 2006.
And you achieved the position of minority whip, which is a very important position.
I was actually leader.
I'm sorry, minority leader. I'm confusing the state with the federal government. Excuse me. Minority leader. And that's a real critical position. Tell us what that position entails, and having played that role, what you learned from that.
So similar to the federal government, you have the leader of either party. The whip is the second in command, who basically has to carry out the edicts or the goals of the leader. So it is a high compliment to call me whip, but my whip her name was Carolyn Hughley, and so I always give her credit for being extraordinary at that job. But the role of the leader is to essentially set the agenda for the party. If you are the majority leader, you are working with likely the speaker, who is the very top person. And so your job is to manage the caucus. But if you're the minority leader, you are the top person for your party in that body. When I became leader in 2010, in November of 2010, I became the first woman to lead a party in the history of the state of Georgia, the first African-American to serve as leader in the House of Representatives, the first Black woman to do any of those things. And the reason I point that out is that part of the job of leader is that you've got to get people to follow you. They have to trust your judgment. They have to trust your strategy. And when they've never seen someone like you do something, it's not just about the title giving you power. You've got to build not only the trust, but you've got to bank some wins. Right. And if you haven't, or if you stumble, the presumption of your capacity is attributed to the thing that's different. They forget very easily that white men who had the job made mistakes too. Every mistake you made is attributed to either your race or your gender or both. And so the role of leader was really to set an agenda, to try to navigate and get as much good done. And the way I would frame it was my first job was to try to find ways to work together with the majority, because their bills were going to pass. And so how do you mitigate the harm? The
Right.
second was to argue your ideological position and let the people know what else they could have if your party were in ascendancy. But then the third was to hold everyone accountable. And often the minority party languishes in obscurity, but when you're the most effective, it's when you are actually the clarion that's reminding the people, here's what's happening with your power, with your money, and to your lives. And that accountability piece for me was the most interesting part of the job. How do you get people who really don't care that much about state government, but state government plays such a heavy role in their lives? How do you get them to focus and thus to start demanding more?
Yes, I mean it's quite a role, and I think we've all seen how important state government can be in our lives. Stacey, you may not remember this, but when I first came to Spelman back in 2015, I met you in your office, and you were serving as minority leader, and we had a lovely conversation. And at the end of it, you told me, "And I'm going to run for governor." So you had that idea in your head long before you actually ran in 2018. So tell us, what motivated you to decide that that's the position that you wanted to achieve?
As I said, my first role in as a so I interned for the EPA, for the Office of Management and Budget, in college and in grad school, but it was working for Shirley Franklin as deputy city attorney that really concretized for me the importance of state government, in part because when Mayor Franklin became the mayor, it was under the first Republican governor since Reconstruction in Georgia. And so typically you'd had a tension between the city and the state that was not driven by partisanship, but more by ideology within the party. This was the first time there was a Republican governor and a Democratic mayor. And what we found, much to our chagrin, was that more of the most progressive pieces of legislation that she tried to offer, that I often either wrote or I oversaw the attorneys who wrote the laws, that the immediate aftermath was that they were nullified by the state. We passed the first living wage law in Georgia. And by the time the legislature came back into session, that bill was nullified. It was preempted by state action saying that the city was not permitted, no city in Georgia is permitted to pass a living wage law. They can only change the wages of their own employees, but they can't import wage laws to anyone else. And this is unlike a lot of northern cities or western cities where local governments have this ability to achieve progress on the local level, even if they can't necessarily create it on the national level. And I saw that happen again and again with important issues where the imprimatur of the state really changed how effective the city could be at tackling some of its most intractable problems. And the more I saw that, the more I decided that the job that I needed to hold would be the job of governor. Because if you look at the hierarchy in the state of Georgia and in a lot of southern states, governors have an exceptional amount of power, more power than governors in other states. And so for me, the intention was to become governor because it's governors who often create either the path to progress or the impedance of so many lives. And the narrative I try to remind people of is that, you know, we know that when you think about stand your ground laws, those weren't created at the federal level. That was done by the that was put into law by the governor of Florida. The evisceration of the social safety net didn't start in 1996 with President Clinton. It started in the 80s under Governor Tommy Thompson of Wisconsin. Mass incarceration didn't start with the 94 crime bill. It started in the 70s under Governor Ronald Reagan in California. And Jim Crow, the most vicious set of laws in American history, never had a single federal law. They were all state laws. And so for me, the role of governor was about making certain that the work that I thought needed to happen, the progress, the treatment of people as equal citizens under the law, but also centering the marginalized, the disadvantaged, those who had been left out of opportunity, that to do that most effectively and most efficiently meant that you needed to have a governor who wanted to do that work. And so for me, running for governor was the job.
That is I don't think I've heard such a superb account of why state government is so important. So really, thank you for that. As you know, Nia and others on the Spelman's campus were just totally energized by your campaign. And we all stayed up and watched election returns that night. And of course, woke up in the morning disappointed. You may recall, we invited you to campus because we wanted to give you a big Spelman hug because we just were so proud of your fearlessness and the way you conducted the campaign and the energy that went into it. You mean the world to us. And you stood in front of our students and you said, I lost the gubernatorial election, but I won. And you went on to describe everything that would happen with Fair Fight. Tell us a little bit about how you stepped out of the disappointment of losing the election to walk into the next phase of your life and your career.
So as you described, November 6th, 1 a.m., they have not called the election. They've called almost every other governor's race that was contested that night, but they had not called our election, or they'd either called it or the candidates had conceded to their opponents. And I did neither. I did a speech that night saying that our responsibility was not necessarily to ensure me victory, but to guarantee that every vote was counted, because we had at that point received tens of thousands of calls about challenges to people, to their ability to vote. And I want to be really clear. No one is guaranteed victory, but as American citizens, we are guaranteed access. And it is, to me, the most ignominious notion that any person's right to vote should be impeded because of someone else's want for power. And the night of that election, my speech was, we're going to fight to make sure every vote counts. For the next 10 days, we filed multiple lawsuits. We won. We had 4 suits. We won 3.5. The half we didn't win, it was outside the purview of the judge to actually grant us the remedy we sought. And I spent that 10 days watching the numbers change, watching the margin of victory or the margin of loss get closer and closer as more and more people's votes got counted, as more people were able to make manifest their rights. But I knew of entire tens of thousands of people who were completely pushed out of the system and not permitted to be heard. My parents raised me to believe that when something is broken, your job is to fix it. That's why they took us to volunteer. Even though we had no running water or the lights got cut off, they would tell us having nothing is not an excuse for doing nothing, that your responsibility is to act. And so in that 10 days, I spent, I did the stages of grief. I'm pretty smart. And when I realized that the Secretary of State was managing the process, I realized it was unlikely that it would turn out in my favor. We were going to fight hard, but he'd been at this for 8 years. I'd been at this for 18 months. And his preparation was probably going to outweigh my determination. My responsibility then was to think about why I ran in the first place. And I mean this sincerely, not getting the title or the platform cannot exempt you from the work. The work that I said I wanted to do, the work of providing access to equality, access to education, economic security, healthcare, job opportunities, those pieces, those policies still needed to be brought to life. And the only way to do so was to ensure that people, first of all, had access to the right to vote. And so fair fight was absolutely necessary. We were going to fight to diminish or demolish this voter suppression apparatus in Georgia. The second thing we needed to do is to make sure that the inputs that were going to decide who we get to vote for, that those inputs were accurate. And that was Fair Count, which works on the census. And that came about because I became leader at the end of 2010, which was a census year. And my second legislative session was going through redistricting. So I still have my nightmares about that process. And so I was going to make certain that we had a more accurate count in Georgia than we had in 2010. And then the third was thinking about the policies that had to be made real. And how do you translate these notions of progress into a system that is not designed the same way Northeastern systems or Western systems are, I like to describe it as translating progress into Southern. And so I created the Southern Economic Advancement Project. And to me, those three entities became an ecosystem, and they serve two purposes. So to your question about disappointment, you have to let disappointment be real. You have to let yourself grieve. And I did. I, with greatest respect to my Jewish friends, I liken it to sitting Shiva. I'm Southern, so it took a little longer, but the whole point was to give myself time to be sad, to be angry, to mourn. But then the next responsibility that I added is plotting. My job then is to get back to work and to think about what can I do without that platform? What can I do without that title and without the resources that come with that power? The best way to supplant disappointment is to invigorate yourself with doing the work that you needed to do in the first place. I gave myself 10 days to get through it. I gave my non-concession speech on the 16th, and we launched Fair Fight that day. We launched Fair Count a few months later, and then SEEP a few months after that. But all three organizations are vibrant and thriving. And for me, the disappointment always lingers. But I know I will never be governor of Georgia in 2018. That's okay, because I won the opportunity to have conversations about these issues. I won a platform to lift up something that has been an infection and a disease in our nation since its inception, and that is voter suppression. And I've been able to compel conversations and solve problems that I may not have anticipated solving in this way, because if I had been governor, I would have had a different experience. But because I see that, my obligation is now to address it.
Yes. I think you've taught us a lot about grieving and moving through our grief, because I think we all experienced, or many of us experienced, disappointment at this current legislation. And we're grieving, and we're angry and resentful. And we are now plotting.
Yes.
And so give us some sense of what you think, what direction you think activism should take in the wake of the recent legislation around voting rights.
So let's be clear. This raft of legislation, it started in Georgia, but it's happening across the country, is a direct and strategic response to the loss of an election. Mm-hmm. But it is grounded in falsehoods and misinformation that have been peddled at the highest levels of government. And this is now being used to justify a return to Jim Crow in voting rights. And the reason I use that language, it is not hyperbolic, if it is a bit incendiary, but it's clear. We forget that while the Jim Crow laws of the South post-Reconstruction primarily used race to tell you where you could eat, where you could sleep, where you could shop, mm-hmm. when it came to voting rights, because of the 15th Amendment, there has not been a voting law that explicitly used race as the predicate. Mm-hmm. It has always been that they target the behaviors and characteristics of people of color, of Black people in particular, to impose restrictions. And so, no, it doesn't have to be that SB 202 explicitly state, we don't want people of color to vote. If they can target the behaviors that they have strategically identified as the reason that the outcome of the elections changed because of the participation of voters of color in record numbers, then that is exactly what Jim Crow did. It is analogous almost to a fault. Mm-hmm. That said, the way we were able to dismantle the Jim Crow laws, part of it was attention. Mm-hmm. Jim Crow laws existed for 150 years, but it was on the bridge, the Edmund Pettus Bridge to Selma, that we had the national attention that led to the Voting Rights Act. And that national attention is what we have to demand now. We have to keep it in the forefront, because every other right, every other responsibility, every other policy that we perceive as necessary is directly tied to voting rights. If you are angered and outraged by the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and Daunte Wright, if you are outraged by those things, there will be no legal action taken. There will be no legislation passed if you do not have the right to elect leaders who share your outrage. And so voting rights it cannot be an esoteric conversation about the act of casting a ballot. This is an existential crisis about our ability to shape the future. We are not guaranteed that we will get all of the things we want, but we will be damned to our silence and to being pushed out of the process if we aren't loud. And so here are the three things I say people need to do. One is that we cannot let this be a 1 week story.
Mhm.
We have to constantly talk about this. Every time there is bad information, every time there is a policy that does not lift up communities, every time someone says, well, I can't do this, we have to then link it back to voting rights and to these bills that are being used in Georgia and across the country to vitiate voting rights. Number two, we have to invest in those communities that are the hardest hit by voter suppression. And that means doing the work of investing in voting rights organizations, either with your time or with your treasure. And the third is that we have to advocate year round for the passage of the voting rights provisions, in particular of the For the People Act and the restoration of the Voting Rights Act through the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Those three things change the future, because without voting rights, if they are able to quash us at this level, there is no
Right.
there's no other law that can pass that can actually benefit us. But what they want, and what in fact they've said, is that they think that if they can just yell and scream louder than we can for a few weeks, it will all become silence and we will forget. We
Right.
cannot forget. We have to be as aggressive and vigorous in our defense of voting rights as we are in the pursuit of any policy we believe needs to be made real, because voting rights is the only way that happens.
Yeah, this sounds very much like the new Atlanta student movement
Yes,
for this generation.
absolutely.
And I know that our students certainly in the Atlanta University Center are very much up to it. We have some questions from the audience, and I just have two more questions I want to ask you. The first is for our seniors who are listening in. This has been a pretty tough year for them. What advice would you give them as they go out into the world?
Use this year as a reminder that you are capable of anything. It is hard sometimes to have perspective when you're in the middle of a crisis, especially a crisis that lasts your entire academic year, the year with most potential for you. But you survived it, and more than that, you thrived. And this year is proof that those things that seem like insurmountable obstacles aren't that. They are difficult, they are painful, and yes, sometimes they will cause you to stumble, but they cannot cause you to fail. Use this moment to remind yourself that you are capable of so much more than you imagined, because you survived isolation, a healthcare crisis, an economic crisis, and in the midst of that, a social justice reckoning. And you did all of that and still managed to learn and to graduate. And if you can pull that off, I don't think there's anything that can stand in your way.
Oh, that's great advice for them, and it's so true. They have been real warriors during this last year, and they have more than risen to the occasion. So we had students also who were entering for their first year in college, having graduated from high school with remote learning into their first year of college. What advice do you have for the first year students who are just beginning their Spelman journey?
It only gets better. I mean, and I mean that in the most sincere way. Freshman year it's a delightful year, but it's also one of the hardest parts of matriculation, because you're trying to figure out who you are in public. You are making your mistakes in front of everyone. You are stumbling through your thoughts and your desires in front of a lot of people that you barely know. You've gotten the opportunity or you've had the misfortune in some ways of having to do this in silence and isolation. But that also means that you've had a chance to think about things with a bit more privacy than others have. And so I would see that it can only get better from here when you are able to return to classes with your peers, when you're able to interact with your professors one-on-one, when you're able to have the social part of the experience. You understand what it could be if you didn't have it. And I think that is a helpful reset. It's not going to be enough to keep that in the back of your mind, but I would use it as a talisman that you are able to make this transition without the supports that so many people have relied on. And that means you are stronger than you imagine. And you can build the next 3 years to be more than many students would ever contemplate, because you have gone through the hardest parts of not only starting a new education, but finding yourself in this space.
Thank you. Great advice for them as well. So now our first question for you, Stacey, is, have you thought about running for president of the United States?
Yes. When I was when I was at Spelman, I had a bad breakup with the boy from Morehouse who said some inappropriate things or unfortunate things about me. And so I was going to prove to him and myself I would be incredibly successful. So I put together a spreadsheet about all the things I wanted to accomplish. And one of those jobs is to be president of the United States. I didn't think it was real. I wrote it down more out of pique than anything else. But where I stand is this. If my ambition is to help improve people's lives, if I want to promulgate policies and do good work for people, especially the marginalized and the disadvantaged, those who are so often left behind, if I believe in both equality and equity, why would I not want to do the job that has the greatest impact on all of those issues?
Right.
We are taught, especially as Black women and women of color, we're taught self-effacement, that this notion that, oh, I can't or I shouldn't, it's not me. I learned humility. I'm not the only one who can, but that doesn't mean that I have to diminish the fact that I can. I can do it. I'm not the only person who can, but I am one of them. And that's going to be my mission. If I'm successful, I will be very grateful. And if I'm not, I will have worked so hard at the work that I think needs to be done that not getting that job again may be painful, but it will not change the whole of who I am and my ambitions for better for others.
And if you are successful, we will be very fortunate. We have a question from Bria Beauvais, our student. And she says, my name is Bria Beauvais, and I'm a junior health science major from Philadelphia. My question is, why did UPS decline an invitation from faith leaders and voting rights leaders to meet? And what impact do companies speaking out have against voting rights? So there are two parts to this question. Why did UPS decline an opportunity to talk to faith leaders and voting rights? And then what's the consequence of companies speaking out?
I can't speak to why they declined. I am disappointed, as are many, that UPS is one of the companies that did not come to that meeting. But I believe in redemption. As I told you, my parents are both United Methodist ministers, and they raised us with a faith tradition that says that you hold people accountable, but you also create space for people and entities to do right. And let's remember, companies are people. They are led by people. They employ people. They have other people as their customers. And what I would encourage corporations to remember is that when we talk about the denial of the right to vote, when we talk about restrictions on those rights, we're talking about your employees. We're talking about your shareholders. We're talking about your customers. Because to the extent that they are denied their full agency as voters, they are denied full participation in our democracy, and that's dangerous. We have seen that happen in authoritarian countries, and it always starts small. It is a rare occasion that an authoritarian populist comes in and sweeps out a whole government. What happens are these surgically precise incremental changes to who can participate. And the difference is that we have now seen what participation can lead to. Democrats should not win every election, nor should Republicans, nor should independents. But partisanship is not an excuse for the denial of citizenship. And I would argue that every corporation who's afraid of wading into a partisan argument is thinking about this the wrong way. This is about citizenship. And if we allow any citizen to be denied their rights, they may start with us, but they're coming for you next. And when you break democracy, you break it for everyone. And that is how we end up with former democracies that are now autocratic dictatorships, or worse, have the semblance of democracy with people who are being oppressed internally. We fight that as a nation, and we should fight that within our nation.
That's absolutely true. And I like very much the distinction between partisanship and citizenship. So Bria, thank you very much for your question. We have another question from one of our alumni, Dr. Fleta Jackson. And she says, I have heard you say that you are a woman of faith. Could you talk about what that means for all the work that you are doing?
My parents had three rules for us when we were growing up: go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. They did not treat these as separate but equal pieces, they were interwoven. Uh, for me, faith is about using my beliefs to live my values. And my responsibility is to not simply say, I believe that people have. There's the scripture about, there will always be the poor among you.
Mm-hmm.
My belief is that that was not an excuse for us to do nothing. It was a challenge and an edict from God to do something about it. And so my work is about how we address those inequities. It is about social justice. If you read the New Testament, it is rife with conversations about what justice should look like. And so my faith tradition tells me that I not only have to believe it, I have to act on it. There is the scripture that says faith without works is dead. But it's also about my education. I have studied as a secular student in the sense that I believe in many of the secular precepts, but they are always undergirded by my faith traditions that tell me that I have to actualize what I do and what I believe in. And when it comes to service, service is about being a shield for others, to protect them. It is never about using my faith as a sword to strike people down, using my religion and my faith tradition as an excuse for denying someone else their humanity or their beliefs. I am always suspicious of those who claim a faith that you cannot see. When you cannot see it in their actions, you have to question whether it's truly embedded in their hearts. And that's different than trying to impose that religion on others. My internal belief systems and my behavioral practices should reflect the values I say I espouse, but I have no right to impose those values based on my faith traditions onto others, which is why I've always rejected religious freedom bills and religious liberty bills, because those are typically an excuse to impose one set of religious values as primacy over others.
Thank you. We have a question which I think may have come from a student, but I'm going to go back to part of the conversation we touched on earlier. And the question is, what would you tell young Black scholars who believe they don't belong in places like Harvard or Yale?
So when I started at Yale, I was already nervous about being there. I have not really talked about this before, but I got there. Had braids. I'd had braids all through college, had them in grad school. And if you've ever had braids, you have to kind of cut them off and unravel them in order to take them out. I ended up giving myself an afro. And I realized in retrospect, it was just sort of my fear manifesting itself with this radical decision to just cut my hair off. And I was in New Haven, Connecticut. There is not a Black barber open on a Monday. And I did this stupid thing on Sunday night and had to get my pictures taken on Monday morning. So I found this Lebanese woman who swore that she could do something with my hair, and she shaped it enough that I didn't look completely ridiculous in my pictures. But I tell that story to say that even with confidence, it is terrifying to be in a space where you don't have the same privileges, the same access, where you haven't grown up believing you belong. Mm-hmm. But that is not a reason not to go. Mm-hmm. My experience at Yale helped me figure out what I was and what I wasn't. I never wanted to be some of those people I met that I may have idolized because of their background and their experiences, but I realized I don't want to have the challenges they have. I don't want the lives they seem to want. But more than that, my intellect is capable of a suppleness and a flexibility that what I don't know when I get there, I can learn. I might have to work a little harder, but it's not that I don't know enough. I may just know different. And what I had to realize that was what I learned at Spelman. There are classes that I took that no student at Yale had ever thought about taking, except for those who come from Spelman. But that didn't diminish the utility of my knowledge. In fact, that meant I just had a secret set of knowledge that they didn't possess. And my job was to make sure I had what they had and that I had what I had and made it stronger. And as Black scholars, That's what we always do. My oldest sister is an anthropologist. She's now the vice president of diversity at her college. And what I've always loved about Andrea's mind is that she has never met information that she doesn't believe she's entitled to possess, but she has never thought that she had to lose her feminist thought, her Afrocentric thought. She's never had to lose something to be more. And that's what Black scholars have to hold on to. We are capable of being more because this is an additive process. It is not one where you have to you have to give one away to take something else in.
Excellent advice. We have several questions from students who want to know how they sign up for internship.
Well, if you go to Fair Fight, so there's Fair Fight, Fair Count, and the SEAP, SEAP. If you Google any of those, you can go to our websites and you can get some information and ask for an internship.
Great. So we have a question here from our faculty, and we're very close to time, but I'm going to try to capture it briefly. I've read that you have a plan that might help to get around the filibuster. Is that the case? And if so, what is the plan?
Well, I have an argument for getting around the filibuster, which is that we have seen, so there are those who argue for complete erasure of the filibuster. I think that's highly unlikely given the current composition of the Senate. But I do point to the exemption that the Senate has made under the Constitution. We have exempted under Article 2 the approval of cabinet officials. They can now be approved on a simple majority vote, not subject to the filibuster. Under Article 3 covers judges. And we have an exemption that now includes the Supreme Court, with a majority vote being sufficient to allow for confirmation. I would argue that Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, which is the elections clause that undergirds how we operate every election at every level of government, that it too should be subject to an exemption, because the foundations of our democracy and changes needed to make our democracy effective should not be held hostage by 10 people who decide they decline to protect our country.
Thank you. We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
And so I'm going to ask you, Stacey Abrams, what's next for Stacey Abrams?
Right now, I'm fighting on 3 fronts, and I mean this very sincerely. Fair fight, because we are facing these voting rights assaults across the country. Fair count is working hard because right now, especially in Georgia, but actually across the South, we are having a COVID vaccine distribution challenge. It is not just about hesitancy. It is often a lack of access. If the only place to get the vaccine requires that you own a car and you are from a community that doesn't have public transit, we have to solve the problems of poverty, even in the midst of COVID. And then number 3, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, we created a project called South Strong, where we are working to look at what happens after COVID. How do you use COVID recovery to build a public health infrastructure and a public benefits infrastructure that actually is better than we had, because what we have now is broken for too many people. If I can keep doing that work, I will eventually decide what I'm going to do next in the political arena, but I've got enough to occupy my time right now.
Can you give us those websites again, so everybody who's out there in the audience can log in and sign up?
fairfightaction.com, faircount.org, and theseap.org, SEAP.org.
Thank you, Stacey Abrams. We are so proud of you at Spelman College. You have been a leader here at Spelman. You've been a leader in Georgia. You are a national leader. Now you are a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. And we believe that everything that you do has been a plan of action that helps us think through how we can fight through the resistance that whatever it may be. You give us courage, you give us an example, you give us faith. So thank you so much for joining us. My thanks to everybody, all 2,000 of you in the audience. Be well and keep the faith.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell.